The cold of the garage floor seeped through the thin blanket, a damp chill that felt like it was settling deep into Helen's bones. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the early morning air and everything to do with despair. She lay perfectly still, listening. The garage was filled with the ghosts of sounds, the slow, rhythmic drip of a faucet somewhere in the main house, the tired groan of the building's old timbers, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the city that was still hours from waking. The air was thick with the smell of stale oil, damp cardboard, and the faint, sweet scent of her daughter's hair. Every breath she took felt heavy, like she was inhaling failure itself. Her stomach was a tight, aching knot of hunger she had long since learned to ignore, a dull pain that was nothing compared to the sharp, piercing agony in her heart. She was 42 years old, a widow, and this cold, concrete slab was all the world she had left to offer her children. Her friend's apology from the day before echoed in her ears, kind but firm. Their time was up. Today was the day they had to leave. She reached into the pocket of her worn jeans, her fingers brushing against the crumpled paper that was her entire net worth. Carefully, as if the motion might cause it to disintegrate, she pulled out the money and flattened it on the floor beside her. A single $20 bill, 2 10s DZ15D, and a small pathetic pile of singles and coins. She counted it again, for the 10th time since midnight, her lips moving silently in the dark. $50. The number was an insult, a final, cruel joke from a universe that had taken everything. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. The thought of calling her parents was a fleeting phantom of an idea, dismissed as quickly as it came. She could almost hear her mother's worried sigh over the phone, could picture their small, tidy home paid for by a social security check that barely covered their own needs. Her pride, a stubborn, foolish thing, was the only possession she had left, besides the children, and it screamed at her that she could not become another burden on their already stooped shoulders. Her hands felt cold and clammy as she folded the money away, the crispness of the bills a lie against the reality of their worthlessness. A soft whimper broke the silence. To her left, 8-year-old Sophia shifted in her sleep, her small hand clutching a threadbare stuffed bear. Her face, even in the dim light filtering under the garage door, was pale. Helen's heart constricted with a pain so intense it made her gasp. She was a mother, and her daughter was sleeping on a cold floor, hungry. On the other side of her, 14-year-old Luke was awake. She knew it without looking. He lay stiffly, his breathing too controlled, trying to be the man of the family now. He was a boy, just a boy, trying to carry a weight that was crushing his mother. She had heard his stomach rumble an hour ago. A wet, hollow sound he tried to cover with a cough. A silent tear escaped her eye, tracing a hot path down her temple and into her hair. She felt like a fraud, a complete and utter failure in the one role that had ever mattered to her. She had brought these beautiful children into the world, and all she could provide them was a promise of the street. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. The last 6 months played on a torturous loop in her mind, the screech of tires on a wet highway she had never heard but could imagine with perfect, horrifying clarity, the sterile, hushed tones of the police officer at her door, the hollow echo of her own home after the funeral, a place suddenly filled with the ghost of her husband's booming laugh. Then came the second death blow, the letter from the insurance company, crisp, white paper covered in black, impersonal ink. A single word, loophole, had erased a lifetime of her husband's hard work, a decade of premiums paid on time, a pre-existing condition he never knew he had. It was a technicality, a line of fine print that had rendered their future null and void. The eviction notice had followed soon after, its angry red letters a brand on their lives. They were out, the life they had built, the mismatched furniture, the pencil marks on the doorframe marking the children's growth, all of it gone, swallowed by a world that didn't care. The distant sound of a car starting up outside jolted her back to the present. Her friend was getting ready for work. The sound was a countdown, a final warning. The cold dread in her stomach began to solidify into something else, something hard and sharp. Resolve. She could not lie here and let her children wake up to this same hopelessness. She could not let them see her break. The street was next. Hunger was no longer a future threat. It was a present reality. She had $50 and 2 children who believed she could still perform miracles. As she gently pushed herself up, the ache in her back a grim reminder of her situation, a desperate plan began to form in the ruins of her mind. It was a wild, foolish gamble, born of sheer terror, but it was something. And right now, something was infinitely better than the suffocating nothing that was pressing in from all sides. She had to move. She had to fight. She had to try anything. The desperate plan, flimsy as a spider's web, had come from a crumpled newspaper ad for a salvage yard auction on the city's desolate outskirts, a place for junk, a place for the hopeless. It felt like a sign, the only one the universe was offering. She gently shook Luke, then Sophia, their sleepy groans a painful counterpoint to the frantic racing of her heart. The $50 in her pocket felt like a burning coal against her thigh. She had to turn it into something. She explained the idea in a hushed, overly bright voice that sounded fake even to her own ears. A place of our own, she'd said. A little adventure. Luke's skeptical silence was hard to bear, but Sophia's sleepy, trusting nod gave her a sliver of strength. They would walk to the bus stop, ride to the edge of civilization, and find a miracle in a pile of other people's trash. The sheer, terrifying insanity of it made her feel lightheaded, but the alternative, doing nothing, waiting for the street to claim them, was a black hole that threatened to swallow her whole. This was motion. This was a fight. The journey was a public walk of shame. The bus ride felt endless, each stop a new stage for their quiet humiliation. Helen was acutely aware of their appearance, the slight odor of the garage clinging to their clothes, the worn-out state of their shoes, the haunted look in her own eyes she'd glimpsed in a shop window. People stared for a moment. Or worse, they made a conscious effort to look away, their pity a sharp, invisible sting against her raw nerves. The bus rumbled and hissed, its mechanical groans merging with the growing cacophony of the city. Helen held Sophia's small, warm hand, feeling the child's absolute trust like a physical weight on her soul. On her other side, Luke sat stiffly, staring out the window, his jaw set in a hard line of teenage anger and embarrassment. Every lurch of the bus seemed to jostle the knot of ice-cold fear in her stomach. She could feel her palms sweating, her breath shallow. Was she a brave mother fighting for her family, or a fool leading them on a wild goose chase toward even greater despair? The question repeated itself with every passing mile. Their final stop was a dusty patch of gravel by a rust-streaked fence. Before them lay the salvage yard, a sprawling graveyard of forgotten things under a merciless sun. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal, stale gasoline, and the dry, choking scent of dust. The screech of a crane moving a crushed car sounded like a prehistoric beast's death cry, setting Helen's teeth on edge. It was a landscape of decay, of broken dreams and discarded histories, twisted skeletons of cars, mountains of tires, and piles of scrap metal baking in the heat. Her stomach churned with a fresh wave of nausea. This was the end of the line, a place where things came to die. A profound sense of dread washed over her, chilling her despite the blistering heat. Was this really where she had brought her children to find salvation? It felt more like a preview of the hell that awaited them. She felt Luke and Sophia press closer to her, their small bodies seeking a comfort she was terrified she could no longer provide them with. The auction was already in progress, the auctioneer's voice a rapid-fire, rhythmic drone that was nearly impossible to follow. He stood on a small, rickety platform, presiding over a crowd of about 30 people. They were mostly men with calloused hands and faces weathered by sun and cynicism, their eyes scanning the lots with practiced indifference. Helen, holding her children's hands, felt utterly exposed, a soft-shelled creature in a world of hardened scavengers. She clutched her worn purse, the $50 inside feeling both infinitely precious and laughably insignificant. She tried to appear as if she belonged, as if she knew what she was looking for, but she could feel the occasional curious glance in their direction, sizing them up, dismissing them. A tremor ran through her hand. This was a mistake. They were out of their depth, lambs in a den of wolves who picked over the bones of the world for a living. She just wanted to turn and run, to flee back to the cold but familiar misery of the garage they'd just left. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a far corner, almost as if it were hiding, was a 1970s Airstream trailer. It was a silver ghost from another era, its iconic, curved aluminum body, a stark contrast to the angular wreckage surrounding it. But time had been cruel. A long, angry gash of rust ran down its side like a deep, unhealed scar, and its surface was pockmarked and dull. The tires were completely flat, the rubber cracked and peeling, the wheels sinking slowly into the dirt as if the earth were trying to reclaim it. It looked abandoned, forlorn, a beautiful thing that had been left to rot. It looked, she thought with a pang of bitter recognition, just like she felt. Her feet, seemingly of their own accord, began to move slowly towards it, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. She felt a strange kinship with this broken-down relic. Maybe two broken things could come together to make one whole, she thought, the idea a dangerous spark in the dry tinder of her desperation. It was a foolish, romantic notion, but it was all she had. Despite the visible decay, a powerful vision flooded Helen's mind, so vivid it made her gasp. She didn't see the rust or the flat tires. She saw a home. She saw a roof that didn't belong to a friend, a door that she could lock against the world. In her mind's eye, she could almost smell a simple soup simmering on a tiny stove, its warmth filling a small, clean space. She pictured Sophia curled up in a lower bunk, safe and sound, her stuffed bear beside her. She pictured Luke at a small fold-down table, a book in his hands, the tense line of his shoulders finally relaxed. The image was a potent anesthetic, numbing her to the grim reality just inches from her face. This could be it. This had to be it. It was more than a metal shell. It was a container for a future, a chance to put a barrier between her children and the cold, hard ground. The desperate hope was a physical force, tightening her chest and making it hard to breathe. The trailer became a symbol, a last stand against the encroaching darkness. It was everything. The auctioneer finally moved on to the corner where the trailer sat. "All right, folks, lot 73. The aluminum can she," he drawled, a slight smirk on his face. A few of the men in the crowd let out a low, derisive chuckle. The sound grated on Helen's nerves. "Who'll start me at $10 for it? $10. Just gotta haul it out of here yourself." He paused, scanning the unimpressed faces. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. $10. The number slammed into her. It was a fifth of her entire world. The price of food for 2 days. The bus fare to nowhere. She looked at the men around her. Their expressions ranged from disinterest to outright disdain. No one moved. No one spoke. It was junk, and they all knew it. To them, it was a liability, a worthless heap of metal that would cost more to move than it was worth. But to Helen, their indifference was a gift. It was a chance. The silence stretched on, and she felt a wild, terrifying pulse begin to beat in her throat, a drumbeat of destiny. Her decision was a spasm, a reflex born of pure terror. Before her conscious mind could object, her hand shot up, a shaky, uncertain flag of surrender to fate. I will," she heard herself say, her voice a thin, cracking whisper that was nearly lost in the open air. The auctioneer's head snapped in her direction, his eyes finding her in the crowd. For a brief second, she saw a flicker of genuine surprise in his expression, quickly replaced by a practiced, professional mask. $10 from the lady," he barked, his voice booming now that the inertia was broken. He swept his gaze across the other bidders, a silent challenge. "Do I hear 15? $10? A bargain for a piece of history?" But there was no response, only the sound of the wind whistling through a pile of scrap metal. "Going once." Helen held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes a heavy blanket of curiosity and contempt. "Going twice." The words hung in the hot, dusty air. Helen's vision began to tunnel, the faces of the other men blurring into a single, judgmental mass. She could feel Luke's hand tighten its grip on hers, his young mind surely grasping the monumental significance of this moment. She had just bet their survival on a rusted-out shell. If no one else bid, it was hers. If someone else bid, her gamble was lost. And so was a fifth of their precious little money. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, praying with an intensity she hadn't felt since her husband's accident. "Please," she thought, "please, just let this be enough." The world seemed to stop, waiting for the final word, for the sentence to be passed on her reckless act of faith. Sold. For $10 to the lady with the kids." The gavel cracked down on the wooden podium like a gunshot, the sharp final sound echoing across the junkyard. It was done. It was theirs. The transaction felt utterly surreal, a dreamlike exchange in the sweltering heat. Helen walked toward the auctioneer's platform, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She fumbled in her purse, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a worn $10 bill. She handed it to a man with grease-stained fingers and a bored expression, who took it without making eye contact. In return, he dropped a single, rusty key into her outstretched palm. The metal was cold and sharp-edged against her skin, and it felt impossibly heavy, like the weight of her entire future had been condensed into this small, corroded object. As she turned away, she heard a low murmur ripple through the dispersing crowd, and she caught the words, "Poor woman," and what's she gonna do with that? The pity in their voices was like acid, burning away the fragile victory. She ignored them, her focus narrowing to the silver shape in the distance. "Come on," she said to her children, her voice stronger than she felt. The walk toward their new home felt 100 miles long, each step a mix of heart-pounding fear and a desperate prayer that she hadn't just made the final, fatal mistake. The closer they got, the more her fragile hope began to fray. From a distance, the trailer had possessed a kind of romantic, vintage charm. Up close, it was a horror. The aluminum skin was not just dull, it was pitted and corroded, with patches of white, chalky oxidation that looked like a disease. The long gash of rust she had seen from afar was a festering wound, peeling back layers of metal. A large, spiderweb crack marred one of the main windows, distorting the world outside into a fractured nightmare. The door hung slightly askew on its hinges, creating a gap at the top. Helen's heart, which had been soaring moments before, began a slow, heavy descent into the pit of her stomach. This was worse than she had imagined, much worse. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of rust and oil, and fitted the rusty key into the lock. It resisted at first, refusing to turn. She jiggled it, her desperation growing with each passing second, until it finally gave way with a loud, grating click that sounded like a breaking bone. The moment the door swung open, a putrid wave of air rushed out, a physical force that made all three of them stagger back. It was a thick, gag-inducing stench, a complex symphony of decay. The dominant notes were the damp, earthy smell of rot and the sharp, acrid odor of rat droppings and old urine. Underlying it all was a cloying scent of mildew and decades of trapped, stale air. It was the smell of absolute neglect, of something that had been sealed and left to die from the inside out. Helen instinctively slapped a hand over her nose and mouth, her stomach heaving. Little Sophia buried her face in her mother's side, letting out a small, terrified whimper. Luke, his face pale, just stared into the dark opening, his expression hardening into one of disgust and betrayal. The beautiful, hopeful vision of a cozy home evaporated in that single, foul breath, replaced by the choking reality of a tomb. The silence between them was thick with disappointment and the overpowering smell of decay. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, dusty light filtering through the grimy windows, revealing the full extent of the nightmare within. The interior was a scene of utter devastation. The upholstery on the small bench seats was not just torn, it had been shredded and rotted away by moisture and vermin, exposing the yellowed, crumbling foam underneath like decaying flesh. Dark, sinister-looking stains of unknown origin covered every surface, mapping out years of leaks and filth. The ceiling was a geography of water damage, with large, brown continents of dampness and spreading archipelagos of black mold. From the center of the largest stain, a single drop of oily brown water gathered, swelled and fell with a soft, sickening plink onto the filthy floor. The sound was an echo of her own hopes hitting rock bottom. This wasn't a shelter, it was a biohazard. This wasn't a home, it was a disease, and she had just paid to bring her children inside it. A cold dread, far worse than anything she'd felt before, began to seep into her bones. She forced herself to take a hesitant step inside, her shoe making a sticky or peeling sound on the cracked linoleum floor. The small galley kitchen was a disaster zone beyond words. A thick, greasy layer of black grime coated the tiny stove and sink, so thick it obscured the metal beneath. The cabinet doors hung open at odd angles, revealing shelves caked in more droppings and the desiccated, brittle husks of dead insects. The air inside was stagnant and suffocatingly hot, the metal walls of the trailer acting like an oven, baking the filth and concentrating the stench. She reached out and touched a wall, a motion she instantly regretted as her fingers came away coated in a cold, slimy film. The feeling of utter, complete and catastrophic failure washed over her, a cold and absolute wave that threatened to drag her under. She had taken her children from a cold garage floor and brought them here, to this cesspit, to this monument of filth and decay. The shame was suffocating. Turning, she saw her children's faces, and her heart shattered into a million pieces. 8-year-old Sophia was openly crying now, her small face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wide with a terror that Helen had sworn she would always protect her from. And Luke. Luke stood frozen in the doorway, his 14-year-old face a mask of stony disappointment. The last flicker of childhood hope and trust she had seen in his eyes at the auction was gone, extinguished completely. He didn't say a word, but his silence was a screaming accusation, louder than any shout could ever be. It said, "This is what you've done. This is where you've brought us." Helen's own tears, which she had fought back for so long, finally broke free, tracing hot, silent paths down her cheeks. This wasn't a step up from the garage. It was a plunge into a deeper abyss. She had gambled and lost everything. This rusty, stinking trailer wasn't a symbol of hope. There was a hot metal coffin, and she had just locked her family inside. The crushing weight of her failure was absolute. For a long moment, Helen simply stood there, frozen in the doorway, her tears mixing with the sweat on her face as she looked upon the ruin she now owned. The stench was a living thing clawing at her throat, but then she felt a small tug on her shirt. It was Sophia, her face buried in Helen's side, her small body trembling. The feeling of her daughter's fear was a jolt of electricity, a shock to her paralyzed system. She could not fall apart, not here, not in front of them. A grim, bitter resolve hardened within her. If this was to be their home, even for one night, she would not let them sleep in this filth. It was a futile gesture, an act of defiance against an uncaring fate, but it was an act. "Okay," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Okay, we clean. We start." It was the only thing she could think to do, a single, forward-moving action in a world that had ground to a halt. The thought of starting felt impossible, but the thought of doing nothing was infinitely worse. The work was grueling, a punishment for a crime she didn't commit. Helen found a single, stiff-bristled brush and a bucket with a hole in it. She used one of her husband's old T-shirts, a precious relic, as a rag. The sound of her scrubbing was a harsh, rhythmic scrape against the grime, a lonely sound in the oppressive heat. The wet rag only seemed to smear the filth, releasing a fresh, sickening wave of damp, mouldy odor with every pass. Her muscles, already sore from a night on the concrete floor, screamed in protest. Her back ached, and a dull throb started behind her eyes. Luke, seeing the grim set of his mother's jaw, grabbed a piece of cardboard and began to scrape at the floor, his silence a heavy cloak of resentment. He worked with a furious, angry energy, his movements jerky and violent. Sophia, trying to help, used a dry leaf to try and sweep a small pile of dust and dead flies, a child's pathetic attempt to make order out of chaos. It was a miserable, soul-crushing tableau, a broken family trying to scrub away their own despair. After what felt like an hour, Helen set them to work on the bunk beds, which seemed the least horrifying part of the trailer. It was a small, definable space, a task that felt slightly less overwhelming than cleaning the entire tomb. "Just wipe down the wood, sweetie," Helen said to Sophia, her voice strained with false cheerfulness. "Let's make this part nice and clean for you." She watched her daughter, a small, diligent figure in the gloom, meticulously wiping the wooden frame of the lower bunk with a corner of her own T-shirt. The sight caused a fresh pang in Helen's heart. An 8-year-old girl shouldn't be cleaning rat droppings. She should be in a clean bedroom, playing with dolls. The injustice of it all was a physical pain. Sophia, however, was lost in her task, her focus absolute. It was in that quiet focus that the world pivoted. In the middle of a wipe, her small hand stopped. "Mommy," she said, her voice small and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. This board is wobbly. Helen barely heard her at first, lost in her own cycle of exhaustion and grief. That's okay, sweetie. Everything in here is a little broken, she murmured, not even turning around. But Sophia was persistent. No, look, she insisted, pushing at the panel with her small hand. It moves. The soft thump-thump sound of the wood hitting the frame behind it was odd. It wasn't the rattle of something loose. It was a deeper, more solid sound. Against her better judgment, a tiny spark of curiosity managed to penetrate Helen's wall of misery. She sighed, her bones creaking as she knelt down on the sticky linoleum floor, the smell of decay intensifying as she got lower. She put her hand on the flat wooden panel that formed the base of the bunk. Sophia was right. It shifted under her touch. A slight but definite give that the panels around it did not have. It was a small thing, a tiny imperfection in a sea of catastrophic flaws, but it was different. For the first time since opening the door, she felt something other than despair. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the edges of the panel. That's when she saw them. Near one of the corner screws, almost hidden in the grain of the dark wood, were a series of tiny, deep scratches. They weren't the random marks of age or damage. They were precise, clustered right around the screw head, the telltale sign of a tool, a screwdriver most likely, slipping repeatedly as it turned. More than that, the wood itself around the screw was slightly worn, the varnish rubbed away, suggesting it hadn't been turned just once, but many, many times. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. This wasn't just a loose panel. This was a panel that was designed to be opened and closed and opened again. A secret. The word bloomed in her mind. A strange and dangerous flower. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold dread she'd been feeling, traced its way down her spine. This was a place of secrets, and she had just found the keyhole. The air in the trailer suddenly felt charged, heavy with unspoken possibility. A new energy surged through her, sharp and electric. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a focused, almost feral intensity. Her world, which moments before had been a vast landscape of misery, had shrunk to the size of this single, 4-foot wooden panel. "Luke, Sophia, stand back by the door," she said, her voice low and steady. The change in her tone was so abrupt that both children obeyed instantly, their eyes wide and fixed on her. She needed a tool, something to pry with. Her mind raced. The filth of the kitchen, which had repulsed her minutes ago, now seemed like a treasure trove of possibilities. She moved quickly to the small galley, her hands no longer hesitant as she rummaged through the disgusting drawers. She ignored the sticky film and the dead insects, her fingers searching for anything made of metal, anything with an edge. Her hand closed around something hard and flat. It was a kitchen knife, its blade dull and stained with patches of rust, its wooden handle slick with ancient grease. It was a pathetic, worthless thing, but in that moment it felt like a scepter. She returned to the bunk, her heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm. Kneeling again, she wedged the tip of the rusty knife into the thin gap between the wobbly panel and the solid frame. The metal scraped loudly against the wood, the sound echoing in the small, silent space. She pushed. The panel didn't budge. The knife blade, soft and old, began to bend under the pressure. A wave of frustration washed over her. Was this just another dead end? Another piece of junk in this rolling scrapyard? The image of her children's disappointed faces flashed in her mind. No! She repositioned the knife, angling it deeper, and pushed again, this time putting the full weight of her body, of her desperation, into the movement. There was a sudden, sharp crack as the dry wood around the screw finally splintered. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the confined space, making her jump. The panel had given way just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. Hope, wild and fierce, flared in her chest. With the initial seal broken, she worked the knife around the edge of the panel, prizing it open bit by bit. The wood groaned in protest, the sound of a long-held secret being forced into the light. Finally, with one last tug, the panel swung inwards on a pair of small, hidden hinges at the bottom, revealing a dark rectangular cavity in the floor of the trailer. It was a false bottom, a deliberate, carefully constructed hiding place. The air that wafted out was completely different from the trailer's stench of rot. It was a dry, dusty scent, The smell of old paper, aged cloth, and cold metal, an aroma of things long hidden and undisturbed. Helen stared into the darkness, her breath held tight in her chest. Her mind was a whirlwind of impossible thoughts. What could be so valuable that someone would build such a hiding place in a trailer? For a dizzying second, she was terrified. What if it was something awful, something dangerous? But the terror was quickly consumed by an overwhelming, all-powerful need to know. Her hand trembled as she reached into the dark void. The space was deeper than she expected, her arm going in up to the elbow. She flinched, her imagination populating the darkness with spiders and sharp edges. Then her fingertips brushed against something. It was soft, with a rough, waxy texture. Fabric, an old oilcloth, she realized. Her fingers explored further, tracing the shape of what was underneath. It was hard, rectangular and cold. Unmistakably, it was a box. With her heart hammering in her throat, she gripped the object and pulled. It was heavy, far heavier than she'd anticipated, and she grunted with the effort of lifting it out of the compartment and into the dim light. She placed it on the floor. It was a simple metal strongbox, dark green, secured with a tarnished brass latch. Its surface was cool and solid beneath her hands. The sheer physical reality of it, its weight, its coldness, was a grounding force in the surreal moment. Driven by a frenetic energy, she reached back into the darkness. Her searching fingers immediately found another, identical box, then a third. She lined them up on the floor beside the first one, a silent trio of mysteries. But there was more. Her hand brushed against something with a different texture. It was firm, but yielding. She pulled it out. It was a book, about the size of a novel, bound in dark, cracked leather. It felt ancient, sacred. She set it carefully beside the boxes. One last time, she reached in, her fingers sweeping the bottom of the compartment. They closed on a thick, stiff envelope, the paper yellowed to the color of old ivory and brittle at the edges. She pulled it out, her touch gentle, almost reverent, and that was it. The compartment was empty. She sat back on her heels, breathing heavily, and stared at the strange hoard assembled on the filthy floor. 3 heavy metal boxes, 1 leather-bound journal, and 1 yellowed envelope. The world outside, the salvage yard, the $50. It all ceased to exist. The air in the trailer grew thick with a tense, breathless silence. Luke had crept closer, his earlier anger completely forgotten, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Sophia stood behind him, peering around his leg, her thumb finding its way into her mouth. For a long moment, Helen simply stared at the objects, her mind unable to bridge the gap between the disgusting reality of the trailer and the profound mystery now lying at her feet. This treasure, or whatever it was, had been sitting here, feet from where she had stood, weeping in despair just moments before. The sheer cosmic irony of it was staggering. Her hand hovered over the first box, trembling slightly. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment her life would either snap back to its miserable reality or break open into something new and unknown. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the foul air of the trailer filling her lungs, and reached for the latch. The brass latch on the first box was stiff with age. It wouldn't budge. With a surge of impatient strength, Helen grabbed the rusty kitchen knife again and used its tip to pry the clasp open. The metal shrieked in protest, then gave way with a sharp snap. Slowly, as if she were defusing a bomb, she lifted the lid. Her brain stuttered. It took a full 3 seconds for her to comprehend what she was seeing. It was money, not just a few bills, but stacks. Bricks of old, worn US dollars, held together with yellowed paper bands. There were dozens of such stacks, packed tightly into the box. It was an impossible amount of money, more than her husband had made in 10 years of driving his truck. A wave of vertigo washed over her, and she had to place a hand on the floor to steady herself. She heard Luke let out a long, low whistle beside her. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. It was the answer to a prayer she had been too broken to even utter. Her movements were robotic as she reached for the second box. Her hands were shaking so violently now that she could barely work the latch. It clicked open. This box wasn't filled with paper. It was filled with dozens of small, soft cloth pouches, each tied with a simple drawstring. A new kind of dread, mingled with wild anticipation, seized her. What now? She picked up one of the pouches. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. With numb fingers, she fumbled with the knot, pulling it loose. She tipped the pouch over her other hand, a hand still grimy from cleaning. A cascade of small, greenish, rock-like stones spilled into her palm. They were rough, cloudy, and uncut, but they caught the faint light from the cracked window and seemed to glow from within with a deep, verdant fire. Emeralds. She knew it instantly, from pictures, from documentaries. Not one or two, a whole handful. She dropped the pouch and grabbed another, tearing it open. More emeralds. Another, and another. It was a pirate's treasure. At the bottom of the box, beneath the sea of green gems, lay a single, smaller pouch made of dark velvet, tied with a leather cord that was stiff with age. It felt heavier than the others, denser, with a reverence she didn't know she possessed. She untied the cord and carefully unfolded the velvet. There, nestled in the dark fabric, were 5 stones. They were not green. They were clear, like frozen water, but as the light hit them, they exploded into 1,000 tiny, fiery rainbows that danced on the grimy ceiling of the trailer. Raw diamonds, large ones. Her breath caught in a sob, a sound that was half joy, half terror. This was beyond life-changing. This was reality-shattering. The sheer, incomprehensible value of what lay in this box was a weight, a burden, a terrifying responsibility. She quickly closed the velvet pouch, as if the light from the stones was too bright, too dangerous to look at. The sight was too much for her mind to hold. Her gaze fell on the third and final box. It felt mundane now, almost an afterthought. She opened it with a numb, mechanical motion. More money, stack after stack, just like the first. It was a fortune piled upon a fortune. But as the initial blinding shock began to recede, a cold and terrifying question started to form in its place. Where did this come from? This wasn't lottery winnings. This wasn't an inheritance. Fortunes like this, hidden in the floor of a rusted-out trailer, had dark origins. People didn't just misplace this kind of wealth. They hid it because they were running from something, or someone. A cold knot of fear began to form in the pit of her stomach, a chilling counterpoint to the wild elation. She had found a solution to her problems, but she had a horrifying feeling that she had also found a much, much bigger problem. One that had been sleeping for decades and was now terrifyingly awake. Her eyes were drawn to the book. It was the only thing that might offer an explanation. She picked it up, the cracked leather cool and dry against her skin. It felt heavy, filled with words, with a story. She opened it to the first page. The penmanship was bold and clear, a man's handwriting, slightly slanted. The ink had faded from black to a rusty brown. At the top of the page, a date was written, April 12th, 1983. Below it, the first entry began. The deal is done. We are rich, but I have a bad feeling, a feeling cold as a grave. It was a journal, a voice from the past, reaching out from this leather-bound tomb. A shiver ran down Helen's spine. She was holding a ghost's confession. The journal was the key. It held the truth, and she had a sinking feeling that the truth was going to be far more dangerous than the poverty she had been so desperate to escape. She clutched the book to her chest, its solidness a strange comfort. Next, she picked up the yellowed envelope. The paper was so fragile it felt like it might disintegrate at her touch. The metal clasp on the flap was rusted, and she had to work it carefully to get it open without tearing the paper. She slid the contents out onto her lap. There were several folded sheets of thick, official-looking paper, covered in typewritten words. They looked like legal documents, contracts or deeds of sale. There were also smaller slips of paper, receipts with faded carbon copywriting. And tucked inside it all was a single unfolded piece of lined notebook paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting on this page was completely different from the journal's confident script. It was a shaky, frantic scrawl. The letters barely formed, the pen having dug deep into the paper in desperation. It was a short note, but the words she could make out seemed to leap off the page. Murdered, betrayed, Cole took everything. Helen sat back on her heels, the squalor of the trailer completely forgotten. She was no longer in a derelict vehicle in a junkyard. She was in the middle of a crime scene, a time capsule of a violent betrayal that had happened years before she was even married. Before her lay the proceeds of the crime, the money and the gems and the proof, the journal and the documents. The pieces of a violent puzzle were scattered on the filthy floor around her. Who was Arthur, the journal's author? Who was Cole, the man named in the desperate note? And what happened to the man who wrote it? The questions were a roaring torrent in her mind, drowning out everything else. The trailer was no longer a symbol of her failure. It was a treasure chest. Now, a ticking bomb. The story wasn't over. It had just been waiting, silent and patient, for someone to open the box. The woman who had wept with shame at the trailer door just an hour ago was gone, burned away by the stunning discovery. In her place was someone new, someone she didn't recognize. Her mind was a razor, slicing through the shock and fear, focusing on the facts. The money, the gems, the journal, the name, Cole, adrenaline, cold and pure, sang in her veins. The terror was still there, a hard, cold stone in her gut, but it was now wrapped in a fierce, protective resolve. This wasn't just money anymore. This was justice. It was a story that demanded to be finished. She looked at Luke and Sophia, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the raw diamonds she still held in one hand. Their expressions were a mirror of her own, a cocktail of sheer wonder and primal fear. This discovery was for them. This fight, she knew with sudden, chilling certainty, would be for them. She carefully gathered the journal and the envelope, pulling them to her chest as if they were a shield. The metal boxes lay open on the floor, the impossible wealth they contained looking utterly surreal against the backdrop of rot and decay. Dust motes, illuminated by the single beam of sunlight piercing the gloom, danced over the stacks of cash and the glittering gems like tiny, silent witnesses. From the ceiling, the slow rhythmic plink, plink, plink of the leak continued, a steady, indifferent clock marking the seconds in a world that had been fractured and remade. The cloying smell of mold still hung in the air, but it was now mingled with the dry, dusty scent of old money and buried secrets. The drama of her poverty was over. A new, far more dangerous story had just begun, and Helen knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she and her children were standing at its dark and violent epicenter. With the children huddled silently by the door, their faces pale with a mixture of awe and fear, Helen turned her attention from the glittering fortune to the brittle leather journal. The money was a solution, but the book was the truth. Her hands, still trembling, carefully opened the cracked cover. The air filled with the dry, dusty scent of antique paper and forgotten ink, a smell that was infinitely older and more profound than the stench of decay that permeated the trailer. The first page was dated April 12, 1983. Her fingers traced the elegant, faded script. "The deal is done," she read aloud in a whisper, her voice cracking. "We are rich, but I have a bad feeling, a feeling cold as a grave. My partner, James, is celebrating. He trusts everyone. I trust no one." Helen felt a cold dread begin to coil in her stomach. This was not a story of celebration. This was the beginning of a tragedy, and she had just opened the first chapter. The words felt like a cold whisper from the past, spoken directly into her ear. She turned the page, the delicate paper threatening to crumble under her touch. The writer, whose name she now saw was Arthur, described his life as a prospector in the raw, unforgiving gem fields of Nevada. Helen could almost feel the blistering sun, almost taste the grit of the desert dust he described so vividly. He wrote of the thrill of the hunt, the glint of emeralds in the rock, the back-breaking labor that led to their monumental find, a vein of stones so rich it was the stuff of legends. Then, the journal's tone shifted. He introduced the man who financed their operation, the middleman who smuggled the stones overseas. He never used a name, only a title that made Helen's blood run cold: the Collector. Arthur described him as a man made of shadows and quiet threats, a spider at the center of a vast, illicit web, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. The feeling of dread in Helen's stomach tightened into a painful knot. This was the source of the evil she felt humming from the treasure. Her eyes scanned the pages, a frantic hunger for the truth now consuming her. She found the entry she was looking for. October 7th, 1983. The Collector arrived at the camp today, a day early. He brought whiskey and smiled too much. James opened the bottle, but I saw the men with him. They weren't miners. They had the dead eyes of wolves. The air out here is usually so clear, but tonight it feels thick, heavy. I can't breathe. I've told James my concerns, but he called me paranoid. He's laughing with them now. The sound grates on my nerves. Something is wrong. Terribly wrong. Helen had to stop, her own breath catching in her throat. She looked at the stacks of money and the raw, glowing gems. They were no longer beautiful. They were stained with the blood of the story she was reading. She felt a wave of nausea, the same she'd felt that morning, but this time it was born of fear, not hunger. This was the moment the world turned upside down for Arthur. The next entry was a mad scrawl, the handwriting jagged and panicked. The ink smudged as if by a trembling, sweaty hand. I hid. I saw it all from the ridge. He waited until James was drunk. There was an argument, a lie about the percentage. Then the smile vanished from the collector's face. I saw the flash of metal. It wasn't a gunshot, it was quiet, brutal. They held James down. I heard a muffled sound, a sickening crack of bone, and then nothing, just the wind. The silence was the most horrible sound I have ever heard. They wrapped him in a tarp and put him in the trunk of their car. They murdered him for a bag of rocks. Helen slammed the journal shut, a choked sob escaping her lips. She could see it. She could hear it. The brutal, casual violence of it all was a living nightmare, unfolding in her mind. Luke put a protective hand on her shoulder, his young face grim. The treasure wasn't a gift. It was a curse. With shaking hands, she forced herself to open the book again. She had to know the rest. She had to understand the legacy she now held. A few pages later, Arthur detailed his escape. In the chaos, as the collector's men searched the camp for the main stash, Arthur had crept into their small cabin and grabbed what he could. He took the 3 metal boxes, one with the most valuable stones, the others with cash from a recent sale. But most importantly, he had grabbed a leather folio from the collector's briefcase, which had been left open on the table. He didn't know what was inside, only that it felt important. It was that folio, Helen realized, that now sat in her lap, the yellowed envelope. She then unfolded the separate, desperate note again. Murdered, betrayed, Cole, took everything. The name, Cole, it was a fragment, a dying man's last accusation. It must have been James's note, written in his final moments. She found the final entry, dated almost a month later. The handwriting was weary, resigned. November the 1st, 1983, I've made it this far. I've hidden it all in the airstream. The only thing I own that he doesn't know about. He's hunting me. I know it. His name is Warren Cole, and his reach is everywhere. This money, these stones, and they are my revenge, and they are his obsession. He will never stop looking. If you are reading this, it means he finally got me. It means this trailer has found its way to you, and the truth is now yours. This is Arthur's curse, and Arthur's hope. Don't let him win. The book fell from her hands. Helen felt a ghost's cold fingers on her neck. It's your burden now. The words echoed in the silence of the trailer. A direct command from a dead man. The weight of his legacy, his quest for justice, settled onto her shoulders. Heavier than any poverty she had ever known. A sound from outside sliced through the charged atmosphere. It was a sound so alien to the junkyard it was instantly alarming. The low, throaty purr of a high-end luxury engine, followed by the soft, expensive crunch of tires rolling over gravel. It was a sound of immense wealth and effortless power. A predator had entered the scrapyard. Helen's heart instantly seized with a primal terror. Instinct took over. In a single, frantic motion, she swept the journal and the envelope of documents back into the dark compartment under the bunk, slamming the wooden panel shut. It didn't close perfectly, but it was enough to hide the secret. "Get behind me," she hissed at the children, her voice a low, desperate whisper. She scrambled to her feet, her body a shield between her children and the open door, her mind screaming a single, repeating name, Cole. It couldn't be. It was impossible. After 40 years, it was simply impossible. A long, gleaming black sedan, polished to a mirror finish, came to a stop not 20 feet from them. The car was a magnificent, terrifying beast, its dark, tinted windows reflecting the surrounding squalor in distorted, surreal images. The driver's side door opened with a quiet, expensive-sounding click, and a man emerged. He was older, perhaps in his mid-70s, but he moved with a vigor that defied his age. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and gleaming black shoes, an apparition of wealth and authority in this wasteland of rust and decay. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his face a mask of distinguished, grandfatherly lines. But as he turned his head, Helen saw his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes Arthur had described, the eyes of a predator. He began walking toward them, his movements slow and deliberate, a king surveying a kingdom of filth. His expensive shoes trod carefully through the dirt and grime, yet he seemed completely untouched by it, as if surrounded by an invisible shield of power. Helen's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She felt Luke and Sophia pressing into her back, their small bodies trembling. The man's gaze swept over the junkyard with bored disinterest until it landed on the airstream. His eyes locked onto it, and for a split second, Helen saw a flash of something raw and possessive in his expression, a 40-year hunger finally nearing its prize. He was not looking at a trailer. He was looking at a vault. He knew. He had always known what was inside it. The realization hit Helen with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and leaving her weak-kneed with terror. The man stopped a few feet from the open door, his presence sucking all the air from the small space. He fixed a pleasant, charming smile on his face, a practiced expression that didn't touch his cold eyes. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was as out of place as his suit. "I do hope I'm not intruding. My name is Warren Cole." The name hit Helen like a physical punch to the stomach. It was him, the collector, the murderer from the journal. She felt a wave of dizziness and gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning white. "I'm a collector of sorts," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the trailer. "Vintage Americana. I heard through the grapevine that this particular Airstream, a real classic, had finally been located and put up for auction. I've been trying to track this specific one down for decades." His lie was so smooth, so plausible, it was more terrifying than any overt threat. Warren Cole's eyes slid past Helen, peering into the dark, filthy interior. She saw them flick for just a moment toward the bunk beds, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but she saw it. He knew exactly where the secret compartment was. His gaze then settled on her, his smile widening slightly. "It's in a sorry state, I can see. A real shame, but I have a sentimental attachment to these models." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick money clip, peeling off a stack of crisp $100 bills. "I'll give you $5,000 for it. Cash. Right now. You can consider it a handsome finder's fee and a quick profit on your investment. That should be more than enough to help you and your lovely children find a more suitable place to live." The offer was a serpent, glistening and beautiful, offering her an apple, $5,000, an escape. All she had to do was give the devil his due. For a heartbeat, she was tempted. The $5,000 was a lifeline, a ticket out of this nightmare. But then the image of Arthur's frantic script and James's desperate, dying note flashed in her mind. This money wasn't a solution. It was blood money. It was the price of her silence. The weight of Arthur's ghost on her shoulders gave her a spine of steel she didn't know she possessed. She met Cole's cold gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's not for sale." Cole's smile didn't falter, but it became a tight, artificial thing. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Not for sale? My dear lady, everything in this world is for sale, especially for someone in your position. Perhaps you misunderstood. $5,000. It's a very generous offer for a piece of scrap metal." His condescending tone made her blood boil, overriding her fear with a sudden surge of defiance. "No," Helen repeated, her voice stronger now. She pulled her children closer behind her, a mother bear protecting her cubs. "We're going to fix it up. It's our new home." The friendly mask on Warren Cole's face finally dissolved, revealing the cold, hard predator beneath. The pretense was over. He took a single, deliberate step closer, invading her personal space. The cloying, expensive scent of his cologne was suffocating. His voice dropped to a menacing purr that vibrated with barely controlled violence. "A single mother, I see," he murmured, his gaze flicking meaningfully to Luke and Sophia, who were frozen in terror behind her. "Such a shame about your husband. A truck driver, I believe. A risky profession." The words were a perfectly delivered blow, a calculated reminder of her absolute vulnerability. The world was a dangerous place, and he was its most dangerous occupant. He wasn't talking about her husband anymore. He was talking about her. About her children. Accidents happen all the time, he continued, his cold eyes boring into hers. A fire in a junkyard, a faulty gas line in an old trailer. People get hurt, especially children. You should think very carefully about your next decision. Think about their safety. A wise mother always does. The threat, unspoken but crystal clear, hung in the hot, stagnant air between them. It was a promise. He didn't need to raise his voice or show a weapon. His power was absolute, his cruelty a palpable force. He was giving her one last chance to walk away, to choose her children's lives over a dead man's justice. He held her terrified gaze for one moment longer, a silent countdown, then turned with a chillingly casual air and walked back to his immaculate car. The sound of the luxury sedan's engine fading into the distance was the loudest silence Helen had ever heard. She was left trembling, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly her fingers ached, her entire body shaking with a violent cocktail of fear and adrenaline. The treasure hidden just feet away was no longer a path to salvation. It was a signed death warrant. The man who had murdered Arthur and James decades ago now knew that she, a destitute widow with 2 children, was all that stood between him and his prize. She possessed the evidence to expose his entire life of crime, but he possessed the power to erase her from existence with a single, untraceable phone call. She was trapped, caught between a fortune that could grant her children a future and a monster who would stop at nothing to bury his past. What would you do in her place? Would you give up the trailer and the secret, taking the blood money to run for your life? Or would you risk it all, risking the lives of your own children to fight for the justice of a man you never knew? The silence left by Warren Cole's car was not empty. It was a pressurized void, filled with the echo of his unspoken threat. Helen stood rooted to the spot, her hand still clamped on the grimy doorframe, the wood digging into her palm. A cold sweat drenched her shirt, making it cling unpleasantly to her skin. Every rustle of the wind through the piles of scrap metal sounded like the stealthy approach of footsteps. The junkyard, once a symbol of her desperate failure, had transformed into a labyrinth of lethal shadows. She could feel Luke and Sophia trembling behind her, their fear a palpable energy that pulsed against her back. The world had shrunk to the size of this rusty trailer, and the air inside was thick with the stench of Cole's cologne and the metallic taste of pure terror. He had not just threatened her, he had laid out a blueprint of her family's destruction, as casual as discussing the weather. Her mind was a screaming chaos, replaying his words over and over again. Accidents happen. It was a promise, and she knew, with sickening certainty, that he was a man who kept his promises. Her limbs finally obeyed her, and she stumbled back into the trailer, pulling the crooked door shut. It didn't latch properly, leaving a thin crack of light that felt like an accusing eye. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, pulling her children into a fierce, protective embrace. Sophia was crying softly, her small body racked with shudders. Luke was eerily quiet, his face pale and set, the shock having aged him years in a matter of minutes. Helen's heart felt like a block of ice in her chest. The fortune beneath the floor was a poisoned chalice. She could take it and run, but where could she go that a man like Warren Cole couldn't find her? He had known about the auction. He had contacts. He was a ghost who could reach through decades and across the country, and the other option, staying to fight, felt like suicide. She was a broke widow against a powerful, untouchable killer. She buried her face in Sophia's hair, inhaling the sweet, innocent scent of her child, a scent that was now mingled with the stench of mold and fear. A wave of complete and utter helplessness washed over her, more profound than any poverty. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the junkyard that looked like grasping fingers. Time was running out. She knew he would be back. His threat was not an idle one. It was a courtesy, a final chance to surrender before he took what he wanted by force. Helen felt a frantic, caged energy building inside her. She had to think. She had to do something. But her mind was a fog of terror. Every sound from outside, the screech of distant brakes, the clang of metal on metal as a crane operated in the distance, sent a fresh jolt of panic through her system. She looked at the faces of her children, so full of terror and confusion, and a different feeling began to burn through the icy fear. Rage, a hot, primal anger. How dare he? How dare this man threaten her children, her family, after destroying another one 40 years ago? The weight of Arthur's journal, still hidden in the compartment, felt like a physical presence, a silent demand for vengeance that echoed her own burgeoning fury. It was a soft, scraping sound nearby that made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the sound of heavy work boots on gravel, slow and deliberate, approaching the trailer. She held her breath, her body going rigid, her arms tightening around her children until they winced. This is it, she thought. He's back. He didn't even wait for night. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. There was a long, agonizing silence, broken only by the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears. Then, a voice, raspy and thick with age, cut through the quiet. "You all right in there?" it grumbled. That fella in the fancy car didn't look like the type to be shopping for hubcaps. Helen didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't Cole. It was rougher, older. Peering through the crack in the door, she saw a stooped figure, an old man in oil-stained overalls, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips. It was the junkyard owner, the one who had watched her with pity during the auction. She slowly, cautiously, opened the door a few more inches, keeping her body between the opening and her children. The old man squinted at her, his eyes surprisingly sharp and observant beneath bushy white eyebrows. The air around him smelled of cheap tobacco, motor oil, and a lifetime of hard work. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing like a malevolent red eye in the fading light. "Saw him leave," the man said, gesturing vaguely with his chin in the direction Cole's car had disappeared. "Looked like a wolf visiting a chicken coop. You know who that was?" Helen hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust him? In this world of predators, anyone could be an enemy. She simply shook her head, unable to form words. The old man just grunted, a cynical, knowing sound deep in his chest. "Didn't think so," he said, his gaze flicking from her terrified face to the trailer itself. "But I've seen him before, or a man just like him, a long, long time ago." The words hung in the air, a sudden, unexpected anchor in the swirling chaos of Helen's mind. What do you mean?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. The old man, whose name she now recalled was George, took another slow drag of his cigarette before flicking it to the ground and crushing it under the heel of his boot. "That trailer," he said, nodding towards it, "it ain't just any piece of junk. There's a story to it. A fella left it here, must be 40 years ago now. Young fella, prospector type. Scared, real scared. Looked like he'd seen a ghost." George's eyes seemed to look past her, back through the decades. Helen's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Her frantic, hopeful rhythm. This was it, a piece of the puzzle, a voice from the past that was still alive. She pushed the door open wider, a silent invitation for him to continue his story, her entire being focused on his next words. "His name was Arthur," George continued, his voice low and gravelly. "Didn't know him well, but he was a decent sort, paid his bills. One day, he rolls up in that Airstream, hands me a few $100, and asks me to do him a favor. He says, 'George, I need you to look after this for me. Hide it. Keep it safe. Don't sell it, no matter what.' He had this look in his eye, the kind of look a man gets when he knows his time is up." George paused, rubbing his whiskered chin, the memory still vivid in his mind. "He told me the trailer was his life insurance, said there was a powerful man hunting him, a man who'd stop at nothing to get what was inside it, a man he called the Collector." The name, spoken aloud by someone else, sent a violent shiver down Helen's spine. It made it real. It wasn't just a story in a book anymore. The ghost of Arthur was standing right there between them, his 40-year-old fear still clinging to the metal walls of the trailer. George's gaze met hers, Kest, and for the first time, she saw not just pity, but a deep, weary understanding. "I'm an old man, and I ain't one for breaking a promise. I kept it tucked away in the back 40 for all these years, moved it around now and then so it didn't get too settled. But the docs say my ticker's given up the ghost, had to sell everything off, put it all in the auction. I figured after 40 years, whoever was looking for it had given up or died off." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Guess I was wrong." He looked down the gravel road where Cole's car had vanished. "That man who was just here, his face is older, his hair is grey, But his eyes, those are the same damn eyes Arthur described to me. The eyes of the man who was hunting him. That's him, ain't it? That's the collector. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. The final, terrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the full, monstrous picture was finally clear. Helen felt a sudden, strange calm descend over her. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in her gut. But now it had a name, a face, and a history. She was no longer just a victim. She was a witness. She was Arthur's designated heir, the custodian of his vengeance. She looked at George, this cantankerous, dying old man who had unknowingly been the guardian of her fate for 4 decades, and she knew she was no longer alone. She made a decision. "Come inside," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "There's something you need to see." She led the old man into the stinking, cramped trailer. He didn't flinch at the smell or the filth, his eyes only on her. With deliberate movements, she knelt, pried open the loose wooden panel, and revealed the dark compartment. George's eyes widened as she pulled out the leather-bound journal and the yellowed envelope, placing them on the floor between them. He stared at the objects, his mouth slightly agape. The full weight of his 40-year promise made real. She didn't need to explain everything. She just opened the journal to the last page and let him read Arthur's final words, his naming of Warren Cole, his plea for justice. George knelt slowly, his old knees cracking in protest, and ran a trembling, grease-stained finger over the faded script. His breath hitched. "Son of a bitch," he whispered, the words a mixture of awe and fury. "So it's all true. The whole damn thing." He looked from the journal to the open compartment, then back at Helen. His expression transformed. The weariness was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective glint in his sharp eyes. He had not just been storing a piece of metal, he had been guarding a man's last will and testament. His loyalty to the ghost of Arthur now transferred fully and completely to her. "He's not just going to take the trailer," George said, his voice a low growl. "He knows you've seen what's in here. He can't leave any witnesses. He's coming back for you. Tonight." The words landed with the finality of a death sentence. The sun had completely disappeared now, plunging the junkyard into a deep, foreboding twilight. The only light came from a single, bare bulb, glowing feebly over the door to George's small office shack 100 yards away. It seemed like a distant, unreachable star. "What do we do?" Helen asked. The words barely a whisper. The weight of the situation, the sheer impossibility of it, was crashing down on her again. George pushed himself to his feet with a groan. "We can't call the local cops," he said, spitting on the ground. "A man like Cole owns people. He's probably got half the department on his payroll. Calling them would be like inviting the fox into the hen house." He was right. They were completely on their own, trapped in this metal graveyard with a monster on his way. The feeling of the walls of the trailer closing in was overwhelming. The air thick and hard to breathe. George's mind, sharpened by a lifetime of practical problem-solving, was already working. He'll send his boys. They won't be subtle this time. They'll come to take the whole trailer and deal with anyone who gets in the way. His gaze was intense. "You can't be in here when they come. You and the kids, you come back to my shack. It ain't much, but it's solid brick, and there's only one way in." He looked at the open compartment, at the boxes of money and gems glittering faintly in the gloom. "You can't take all that with you. It'll slow you down. What's the most important thing? What's the proof?" Helen knew instantly. The money was just a symptom. The journal and the documents, Arthur's story and James's dying accusation were the cure and the weapon. "The book," she said, her voice firm, "and the documents, and—" She hesitated, thinking of the future her children deserved. The smallest box, the one with the best stones. It was a risk, but it was their future. The next hour was the longest of Helen's life. George returned to his shack to prepare, leaving Helen and the children in the suffocating darkness of the trailer. She repacked the chosen items into a small, sturdy cloth bag, the leather journal, the brittle envelope of documents, the small velvet pouch of diamonds, and a handful of the largest emeralds. The bag felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the fate of 2 families, Arthur's and her own. She hid the bag near the door, ready to be grabbed in an instant. Then, there was nothing to do but wait. The silence was a living entity, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart and the sound of Sophia's whimpering. Helen held her children close, whispering reassurances she didn't feel, her body a taut wire of pure adrenaline. Every creak of the old trailer, every gust of wind was the sound of approaching doom. The darkness outside the cracked window was absolute, a black, suffocating blanket. Luke, who had been silent for hours, finally spoke, his voice a low tremor in the dark. "Mum, what's going to happen?" The simple question was devastating. She had no answer for him. She had led them from a garage to a tomb, and now into the crosshairs of a killer. "We're going to be okay," she lied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "George is helping us. We just need to be brave for a little while longer." She felt like a fraud, whispering hollow promises in the dark. She was terrified, more terrified than she had ever been in her life. The physical ache of hunger was long forgotten, replaced by the gnawing, acidic dread of what the night held. She clutched the cloth bag to her chest, the hard edges of the journal pressing into her ribs. It was her only shield, her only sword. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Not for wealth, not for escape, but just for the chance to see her children grow up. Then they heard it. It wasn't the quiet purr of Cole's sedan. It was the deep, guttural rumble of a heavy-duty truck engine, its sound echoing ominously through the silent junkyard. A pair of bright, harsh headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the rows of wrecked cars and casting monstrous, dancing shadows. The truck came to a stop with a hiss of air brakes, its engine left idling, a throbbing, menacing heartbeat in the night. The sound was a declaration of war. They were here. Helen's blood ran cold. She flattened herself and the children onto the filthy floor, below the level of the windows, her heart hammering against the linoleum. She could hear the heavy slam of 2 truck doors, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel. The footsteps were slow, confident, and they were coming directly toward the trailer. There was no doubt, no hesitation. They knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps stopped right outside. For a terrifying moment, there was only the thrum of the truck's engine and the sound of Helen's own ragged breathing. Then a loud metallic bang reverberated through the trailer as a heavy hand grabbed the door handle and yanked it hard. The broken latch gave way instantly. The door flew open with a violent screech, crashing against the side of the airstream. 2 large, dark figures filled the doorway, their bodies silhouetted against the blinding glare of the truck's headlights. They were big men, built for violence, their faces obscured by the shadows and the intense backlight. They carried no visible weapons, but they didn't need to. They were the weapons. Their presence was an overwhelming wave of brute force and malevolent intent. One of them stepped inside, the entire trailer shifting under his weight, his eyes scanning the dark interior. Helen's mind went blank with primal terror. She was a mouse cornered by 2 enormous cats. She pressed her children's faces into her body, trying to shield them, trying to muffle their terrified gasps. The man's eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness yet, but it wouldn't take long. His partner stood in the doorway, a hulking sentinel blocking their only escape route. The man inside took another step, his boot landing inches from Helen's head. He let out a low chuckle. "Well, look what we have here," he rasped, his voice a low growl. "Boss said we might find some squatters." He knelt, and for a horrible second, his face was illuminated by the light from the door. His eyes were cold and empty, and a cruel smirk played on his lips. He reached out a hand, not for the secret compartment, but for her. He was going to deal with the witnesses first. In that split second, Helen knew they were going to die. She opened her mouth and let out a scream, a raw, piercing shriek of pure, undiluted terror that tore from the depths of her soul. It was a sound of defiance, of a mother's final, desperate attempt to protect her young. It ripped through the night, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet graveyard of machines. The man flinched, startled by the sheer ferocity of it, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second. The other man at the door shifted, annoyed. "Shut her up," he barked. The first man lunged, his hand clamping down on Helen's arm, his grip like a steel vise. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the fear. Luke tried to push himself forward, a futile gesture of a boy trying to protect his mother, but he was no match for the man's size. The situation was hopeless. There was no escape. The world narrowed to the man's cruel face and the crushing pressure on her arm. Suddenly, the night exploded. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a sound far louder, far more apocalyptic. A deafening, earth-shattering crash boom ripped through the junkyard, a cataclysmic shriek of tortured metal, followed by the sound of 1,000 diamonds shattering as a car's windshield imploded. The entire ground seemed to shake from the impact. The man holding Helen's arm recoiled instinctively, his head snapping up, his face a mask of shock and confusion. His partner spun around, staring into the darkness, his hand reaching for something under his jacket. They thought it was an ambush. They thought they were under attack. The sheer, unexpected violence of the sound had momentarily broken their focus, shattered their confidence. The junkyard, which had been their hunting ground, was suddenly an unknown and hostile territory. It was the single moment of hesitation they needed. Through the ringing in her ears, Helen heard George's voice, a roar, desperate roar, from the direction of his shack. "Helen! The bag! Run! Now!" The command sliced through her terror, giving her a single, clear objective. Adrenaline, pure and potent, flooded her system. She didn't think. She reacted. While the henchman was still staring into the darkness, she twisted her arm with all her might. The sudden, violent movement, combined with his own distraction, was enough to break his grip. She scrambled backwards, grabbing the cloth bag that held their entire future. "Go!" she screamed at her children, shoving them toward the open door. The second henchman, still bewildered by the noise, was looking away from them, toward the source of the crash. It was a window of only a few seconds, a fragile, impossible chance at life. They burst out of the trailer and into the blinding glare of the truck's headlights. For a terrifying second, they were completely exposed, 3 small, desperate figures caught in the spotlight. Behind them, they heard a roar of fury as the henchmen realized what was happening. "Get them!" one of them yelled. Helen didn't look back. She grabbed Sophia's hand, put her other hand on Luke's back, and pushed them forward, running with a strength she didn't know she possessed. They ran away from the headlights into the confusing maze of shadows and scrap. Their feet slipped on the loose gravel, and the cold night air burned in their lungs. Behind them, they could hear the heavy, pounding footsteps of the men giving chase. The only beacon of hope was the single, dim yellow light bulb hanging over George's shack. It was their sanctuary, their only hope. They ran towards it, a desperate, stumbling flight for their lives. The shack seemed 1,000,000 miles away. The junkyard was a nightmare landscape in the dark, a minefield of sharp metal edges and treacherous obstacles. A piece of rusted rebar snagged Helen's jeans, tearing the fabric and gashing her leg, but she didn't feel the pain. She just kept running, dragging her children along with her. The sounds of the pursuit were terrifyingly close, the men's angry shouts echoing through the piles of junk. "You can't hide," one of them bellowed. The threat propelled them forward. Helen's lungs were on fire, her legs screaming in protest. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the 2 dark shapes gaining on them, their forms monstrous in the gloom. They were faster, stronger. They were not going to make it. Fear threatened to paralyze her, to make her stumble and fall. But the weight of the bag in her hand, the weight of Arthur's story, spurred her on. They were almost there. Just 20 more feet. George was standing in the open doorway of his brick shack, a grim, determined figure silhouetted against the light from within. "Hurry!" he yelled, his voice a frantic rasp. The footsteps behind them were thunderous now, so close Helen could hear their heavy breathing. Luke stumbled, and Helen caught him, nearly falling herself, her heart seizing with terror. She hauled him to his feet and gave him a final desperate shove toward the light. "Get inside," she screamed. Luke and Sophia tumbled through the doorway. Helen was right behind them, but as she lunged for the threshold, she felt a hand grab the back of her shirt. The fabric ripped, but it was enough to throw her off balance. She fell forward, sprawling onto the concrete floor of the shack, just inside the door. The cloth bag flew from her grasp, skidding across the floor. Before the henchman could grab her, George acted. With a surprising burst of strength, he slammed the heavy wooden door shut. There was a loud thud and a curse from the other side as the man's hand was caught for a second before being yanked back. George threw his entire, frail weight against the door and fumbled with the locks. Helen heard the satisfying, heavy chunk of a deadbolt sliding into place, followed by the metallic scrape of a heavy-duty security bar being dropped into its brackets. A furious pounding began on the door. the wood vibrating with the force of the blows. "Open the door, old man," a voice roared from outside. "You don't know who you're messing with." But they were safe. For now. Helen lay on the floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. She looked at her children, safe and terrified, and at George, his back pressed against the barricaded door, and she knew the point of no return had been crossed. The sounds from outside were a symphony of rage. The pounding on the door continued, punctuated by shouted threats and curses that were muffled by the thick wood. Helen could hear the men circling the small brick shack, testing the single and barred window, their frustration mounting. The noise was terrifying, but it was the sound of thwarted predators, not victorious ones. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust, old coffee and George's quiet courage. He hadn't moved from his post at the door, his frail body a final, stubborn line of defense. Helen pushed herself into a sitting position, her entire body aching, her leg throbbing where the rebar had cut her. She saw the cloth bag lying a few feet away, its precious contents safe. She had done it. She had gotten the proof out. The flight was over, and the real fight was about to begin. She crawled over and clutched the bag to her chest, its weight a comfort against her pounding heart. George finally turned from the door, his face pale but his eyes burning with a grim resolve. The pounding outside had subsided, replaced by the angry rumble of the truck's engine. "They'll be back," he said, his voice raspy but steady, "or they'll just try to burn us out. We don't have much time." He limped over to an old wooden desk cluttered with greasy engine parts and yellowed invoices. He rummaged through a drawer, his movements slow but deliberate. Helen watched him, her mind still trying to catch up with the night's events. The sheer visceral terror of the chase was slowly being replaced by a cold, hard clarity. They had survived the first assault. Now they had to launch the counterattack. They were no longer running. They were cornered, and their only way out was to fight back with the one weapon they possessed: the truth. The story held in the journal was no longer a historical account. It was a live bomb. George pulled a small, dog-eared address book from the desk drawer. He flipped through the pages with a trembling, oil-stained thumb, his lips moving as he searched. "Arthur was a smart man," he mumbled, more to himself than to her. He was scared, but he wasn't stupid. He said if anything ever happened, if his life insurance ever had to be cashed in, there was someone to call. A last resort. He stopped on a page, his finger jabbing at a faded entry. He turned and looked at Helen, a flicker of something like hope in his tired eyes. He didn't point to the address book. Instead, his gaze went to the journal that Helen was clutching to her chest. "Check the back of his book," George said, his voice urgent. "The inside cover. He said he wrote it down there, a phone number. His ace in the hole." Helen's heart skipped a beat. A phone number. A connection to the outside world. A world beyond Warren Cole's reach. With fumbling, desperate fingers, she opened the leather journal to the very back. The final page was blank, but there, on the inside of the stiff, cracked leather back cover, just as George had said, was a line of writing. It was in the same faded, rusty brown ink as the rest of the journal, but the script was small and neat, written with deliberate care. It was a name and a phone number. The area code was for a city hundreds of miles away. It was a fragile, 40-year-old breadcrumb, a desperate message in a bottle that had finally washed ashore. The pounding on the door had stopped completely. All they could hear now was the idling of the truck engine and the frantic beating of their own hearts. This was their only chance. A single phone call to a stranger, a number left by a dead man 4 decades ago. It was a wild, desperate gamble, but it was the only move they had left to play. Helen looked at the number, then at George, then at her children. She took a deep breath and knew what she had to do. The desk phone in George's shack was a heavy black relic, its rotary dial coated in a thin film of grime. Helen's finger, trembling and slick with cold sweat, hesitantly traced the grooves, each loud click of the mechanism a deafening report in the charged silence. The sound of the henchman's truck had finally faded, leaving a void that was somehow more terrifying. She held the cold Bakelite receiver to her ear, the plastic smelling of stale oil and old tobacco, and listened to the hiss and crackle of the line. It rang once, twice, 3 times. A lifetime passed in those seconds. A sleepy, annoyed voice finally answered. "Who is this?" Helen's own voice was a dry, cracking whisper. My name is Helen. I... I was told to call this number by a man named Arthur. He had a trailer. He was a prospector. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence so profound she thought he had hung up. He told me to mention the collector. The change was instantaneous. The sleepy annoyance on the line replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a sound of a ghost being resurrected. The voice on the other end of the line was transformed, shedding its sleepiness like a snake shedding its skin. It became sharp, alert, and imbued with an authority that crackled across the miles. "Arthur's trailer has been found," the man asked, his tone now a low, intense hum of disbelief and focus. "And Warren Cole?" Helen's heart leaped. He knew the name. "Yes," she choked out, a sob of relief catching in her throat. "He was here. He threatened my children." The man let out a string of quiet, professional curses. "Listen to me very carefully. My name is David Renner. I'm a federal prosecutor. 40 years ago, I was a public interest lawyer investigating mining crimes. Arthur was my first unsolved case. A wave of relief so powerful, it made Helen's vision swim, washed over her. This was real. This was help. "Barricade the door," Renner commanded. "Do not open it for anyone. Do not make a sound. I am dispatching a federal team to your location right now. We are coming. Just hold on." The line clicked dead, leaving Helen in the silent shack, clutching a dead receiver, but holding on to the first real glimmer of hope she'd had in a year. The wait was a new form of torture. The adrenaline from the chase began to wear off, leaving Helen with a bone-deep exhaustion and a violently trembling body. George brewed a pot of thick, bitter coffee that tasted like scorched earth, its warmth a small comfort against the chilling fear. The three of them, Helen, Luke, and Sophia, huddled together on a threadbare cot, wrapped in a musty wool blanket. Sophia had finally cried herself to sleep, her small face tear-streaked and pale. Luke, however, was wide-eyed, his gaze fixed on the barricaded door, a silent sentry. Outside, the junkyard was a black void, a landscape of monsters. Every gust of wind that rattled the shack's tin roof was the sound of Cole's men returning. Helen clutched the cloth bag, the hard shape of the journal pressing into her ribs. It was Arthur's voice, his legacy, his desperate reach for justice across 4 decades. She found herself whispering to him in the darkness, a silent promise that she would not fail, that his story would finally be heard. The night stretched on, each minute an eternity. Just as the first hint of a sickly grey dawn began to stain the eastern sky, a new sound permeated the silence. It began as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the powerful, synchronized thrum of multiple heavy engines. It was not the sound of the henchman's truck. This was something else entirely. George and Helen rushed to the small, barred window. A convoy of black, unmarked SUVs was swarming into the junkyard, their movements swift and silent, fanning out with military precision. They moved without lights, wraiths in the pre-dawn gloom. In the distance, the henchman's truck was just getting started, its headlights cutting on, ready for a second assault. They were caught completely by surprise. Agents in dark tactical gear poured out of the SUVs, their forms moving with a deadly, efficient grace. Before the 2 henchmen could even react, they were surrounded, illuminated by a dozen blindingly bright tactical lights and forced to the ground. It was over in 30 seconds. The cavalry hadn't just arrived, it had conquered. Miles away, in a mansion overlooking the city, Warren Cole was sitting in his sun-drenched breakfast nook, a fine porcelain cup of coffee in his hand. He was reading the financial section, a small, confident smile on his face, assured that by now, his 40-year problem had been neatly and permanently disposed of, another messy detail swept under the rug of his immense wealth. The first indication that his world was about to end was the sound of the French doors to his garden shattering into a million pieces. Before he could even register the sound, his serene sanctuary was flooded with armed FBI agents. The newspaper was ripped from his grasp. He was hauled from his chair, the delicate cup crashing to the marble floor. His face, a mask of practiced civility, crumbled into a mask of pure, incredulous fury. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he bellowed. The lead agent, a woman with eyes as cold as his own, simply held up a plastic-wrapped leather journal. "We do," she said, her voice flat. "We know exactly who you are, Arthur." In that moment, Warren Cole, the collector, finally looked his age, old, defeated, and utterly trapped by his own history. Back at the junkyard, the rising sun cast a golden light over the scene, burning away the last of the night's shadows. The world felt clean, new. Helen, wrapped in an agent's warm jacket, sat on the steps of George's shack, sipping hot, sweet coffee from a thermos. She had recounted the entire story, her voice steady now, her hands no longer shaking. She watched as the agents carefully took possession of the journal, the documents, and the small bag of gems, each item catalogued and sealed as evidence. "Mr. Cole is in federal custody," the lead agent told her, his voice kind. "The journal, his partner's note, the sales records, it's an airtight case for murder and a lifetime of racketeering." He then paused, his expression softening. As for the rest of the discovery, since Mr. Cole's enterprise was entirely criminal and the original victims of his smuggling are unidentifiable, the court will rule the assets as unclaimed. For your role in bringing a 40-year-old crime to light, you and your children will be awarded a substantial finder's fee. It will be more than enough. You're safe now, Mrs. Miller. It's over. Months later, Helen sat not on a cold concrete floor, but on a plush leather chair in a high-rise office with a panoramic view of the city. The air didn't smell of mold and oil, but of polished mahogany and the crisp, clean scent of important paper. Across the gleaming desk, a lawyer slid a final document toward her. Her hand, steady and sure, signed her name. The signature finalized the purchase of a house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, established ironclad trust funds for Luke's and Sophia's college educations, and created a private fund to cover every one of George's considerable medical expenses, with enough left over to ensure he could live in comfort for the rest of his life. She felt the weight of the pen, a stark contrast to the worthless coins she had counted in the dark garage. A silent tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow or despair. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming gratitude. The world had taken everything from her, but in the end, in the most impossible way, it had given her back so much more. She was no longer a victim. She was a founder. The new house was filled with light and the sound of laughter. Instead of the rhythmic drip of a faulty faucet, the house was filled with the melodies from Sophia's piano lessons. Instead of the stench of decay, the air carried the warm, comforting scent of baking bread and roasting chicken. Helen stood in her bright, spacious kitchen, looking out the window into a green backyard where Luke, no longer carrying the weight of the world on his young shoulders, was throwing a ball for a golden retriever puppy. Sophia was on a swing set, her legs pumping as she tried to touch the sky, her laughter echoing through the garden. There was a pantry full of food, closets full of new clothes, and beds so soft they felt like clouds. It was a life so far removed from the cold garage floor and the filthy trailer that it felt like a dream. But the solid warmth of the coffee mug in her hands, the sound of her children's happiness, the feeling of safety deep in her bones, it was all real. She was home. In a sun-drenched corner of the garden, nestled amongst rose bushes and a flowering dogwood tree, sat a 1970s Airstream trailer. Its aluminum skin, once scarred by rust and neglect, now gleamed, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the blue sky and the happy green of the new lawn. It was no longer a tomb or a symbol of failure. Helen had it professionally restored, its interior refitted not with rotten upholstery, but with warm wood, bookshelves, and a comfortable desk. It was her private study, a quiet place of peace. It stood as a silent monument to their journey, a reminder that the most beautiful futures can be born from the most broken pasts. George, now looking healthier and years younger, came over for dinner every Sunday. Having used a portion of the funds Helen gave him to turn the junkyard into a thriving classic car restoration business, his promise to Arthur finally fulfilled in a way neither of them could have ever imagined. The rusty key to the trailer now sat on Helen's desk, not a symbol of a desperate gamble, but a key to a life she had earned. Helen's journey from a cold garage floor to a sunlit garden is a powerful testament to the fact that even in the deepest despair, a flicker of hope and courage can change everything. The rusty trailer that symbolized her rock bottom became the very vessel of her redemption, proving that sometimes treasure isn't just gold and jewels, but the justice and peace that come from fighting for what is right. Helen's story reminds us that resilience is the human spirit's greatest strength. If narratives of profound struggle and triumphant victory against impossible odds resonate with you, and you believe in the power of a story to inspire, then consider subscribing to our channel. Press the notification bell, because you won't want to miss the next incredible journey we unearth from the shadows. Every story has a secret waiting to be discovered, and we are here to bring them into the light. One incredible tale at a time, proving that hope is never truly lost.